Chapter 8, Treatments Pt. 1. The lack thereof. There's been a global oblivion to the idea of treating patients with COVID-19. And that's everything. That's what Americans want to know. They want to know, doctor, when I get COVID, how do I avoid two bad outcomes, hospitalization and death? Patients get sick. They get sick for 2 weeks at home until they can't breathe anymore, and then they become hospitalized, and almost everybody dies in the hospital. My emphasis. Dr. Pt.1. In the previous 2 chapters we outlined a variety of ways in which the healthcare system, following the orders of centralized public health departments, misdiagnosed a viral pandemic using false tests and nonsensical methodologies. This, however, is not to say that there was not worse sickness and or more death in 2020, and beyond. In the United States there certainly was, which is unsurprising when considering the destructiveness of the public health actions we've described to this point, including the consequences of lockdowns, an onslaught of unnecessary stress/fear, the recommendation/mandate of unhygienic practices such as mask wearing, and the impact on health of anti-social behavior. But these things alone only scratch the surface on the cause of the devastation experienced in hospitals and nursing homes. In this chapter, we will explain the rest and answer the question, what is the disease COVID-19? As Dr. Pt. points out in the video from which the above quote is sourced, the focus from the beginning of the alleged pandemic was inoculations. 2. In a later chapter we will go very deep on demonstrating that by their own admission selling the public on these inoculations was the basis of the entire fraud, and we will explore the reasons why that was the case. However, the point McCullough drives home here is that there was no effort given by national or international public health organizations to provide, suggest, or recommend treatments outside of hospitals. In the context of the goal being universal inoculations, the reason for this should be obvious. If there's a cure, there's no incentive to inoculate. Once in a hospital, a person's fate was effectively sealed, as he also mentions. This is because the treatments recommended by public health officials, including but not limited to Anthony Fauci, were not treatments at all. Like the inoculations, these drugs had horrendous risk profiles, a fact which would have been known by Fauci himself, among others. However, no one questioned the horrendous outcomes in hospitals, places meant to prevent death and treat disease, because of the assumed novel nature of what was being faced. But what was truly novel in this case was the drugs/strategies recommended to and utilized by these hospitals. And the devastation which resulted served only to further the panic of both the public and the hospital care givers themselves. Thanks to this panic, as well as the financial incentives to diagnose COVID patients, many of these hospitals happily followed the misguided orders of those providing the incentives. At the same time, outpatient and early treatments were being effectively administered in the thousands by physicians including Dr. McCullough, Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, and Dr. Pierre Corey, to name a prominent few. Unlike the public health organizations, these physicians were actually providing care to patients throughout 2020 and beyond. They used known, repurposed drugs with infinitely lesser risk profiles, and they did so to great success. For their efforts, they were censored, slandered, and threatened, many times with the support of the public health organizations whose actions they opposed. We will cover more on these physicians and their treatments in the next chapter, Treatments Pt. 2. For now, I understand these are big claims. What I am hypothesizing here is that the novel misguidance of public health organizations, as followed by hospitals, caused the very sickness and death people attributed to a viral pandemic, in my opinion without evidence, based on all previous support. But there is a landslide of evidence for this hypothesis which I will provide here, and with all the hysteria of the past 2 years it should not be all that difficult for someone who lived through it to imagine this at least being a possibility. What I am not alleging here is bad intent on the part of hospital systems as a whole, nor am I accusing your doctor/nurse cousin of any wrongdoing. In my professional career I have personal experience with hospital systems lying for financial gain and being caught/punished for it. Given that, I know there would have been corruption during such a time as this when financial incentives were so dramatically misaligned. And one need only recall former CDC Director Redfield's remarks we highlighted previously on this very point to see that I'm not alone in this understanding. But I also do not think hospitals and their staffs would have needed to be in on anything sinister intentionally in order for such a result to have occurred. Many of these people faced extraordinary pressure, which was exacerbated by a type of war-time propaganda which was so on the nose it literally saw them referred to as front-line heroes. Many of them are heroic for their efforts, in the same way a soldier is heroic for theirs. The problem in my opinion, however, is that these heroes were sent to the front line with bad information, provided by people who did not deserve the trust they were given. And just like in war, this is a losing strategy. Fauci's standard of care drug and the fraud on which it was supported. This drug remdesivir happens to be blocking an enzyme that the virus uses, and that's an RNA polymerase, but there's a lot of other enzymes that the virus uses that are now gonna be targets for this. This will be the standard of care, my emphasis. Anthony Fauci from the White House, April 29, 20203. Though most will not realize it, April 29, 2020 would turn out to be a monumental day in the history of the COVID era. Specifically, 3 things happened simultaneously on that same day. Anthony Fauci declared remdesivir the standard of care for treatment of the pneumonia-like symptoms of COVID, based on a NIAID-sponsored study. His own organization, a couple hours prior to Fauci's announcement, Gilead Sciences, the maker of remdesivir, released a statement on positive data from National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases study of investigational antiviral remdesivir for COVID-19. For The Lancet published a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center trial on remdesivir use in adults with severe COVID-19 symptoms, which found remdesivir was not associated with statistically significant clinical benefits, and more patients in the remdesivir group, 12%, than the placebo group, 5%, discontinued the study drug because of adverse events or severe adverse events. 5 These events occurring together is fascinating for a variety of reasons, especially considering, as acknowledged by the Alliance for Human Research Protection, AHRP, that it was based on the aforementioned positive data from the NIAID-sponsored study, and Fauci's White House promotion of it, alone, that the FDA ultimately approved remdesivir for emergency use against COVID, as soon as 2 days later on May 1, 2020.6. And per a Science magazine expose, the FDA never consulted a group of outside experts that it has at the ready to weigh in on complicated antiviral drug issues, prior to the approval, which is typically a commonplace best practice. 7 To be clear, this was a drug which in Gilead's own statement they admitted was not yet licensed or approved anywhere globally, for any purpose, and had not yet been demonstrated to be safe or effective for the treatment of COVID-19. 8 Given this caveat by the drug's manufacturer and the negative findings of the Lancet study, one would think the NIAID-sponsored study would have to have had airtight execution with downright impressive results to have led to such a swift FDA action. Unfortunately, this could not have been further from what happened. First of all, as described by Olivia Goldhill of the publication Quartz, the data of the NIAID study was not peer-reviewed prior to its use for EUA approval, nor was it even made available to researchers for this purpose. 9 While there's definitely a space to announce things ahead of peer review, says James Heathers, a research scientist at Northeastern University, this does not justify Fauci's gold standard claim, or the FDA's EUA without necessary peer review. And in the words of Holly Fernandez Lynch, a medical ethics professor at the University of Pennsylvania, even Tony Fauci needs peer review. Second, when asked about the Lancet's randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study, considered the gold standard of trials generally, Fauci dismissed it as not adequate, apparently due to its smaller size. This is an interesting take considering that despite the NIAID study's larger size, Reuters News reported that prominent leaders in the medical community were not impressed with the outcomes of the NIAID study's primary endpoints, goalposts used to measure success, which were revised mid-study from a reduction in death to improvement in date of recovery. 10,11 One of those leaders was Dr. Eric Topol, director and founder of the Scripps Research Translational Institute, who actually referred to the Lancet trial as the only thing I'll hang my hat on, and called the results negative. It was expected to be a whopping effect. It clearly does not have that. This quote from a Reuters acknowledged prominent doctor also completely contradicts Fauci's claim about the Lancet study that it was not an adequate study, and everybody in the field feels that. 12 Clearly not the case. Clearly a lie. And this is to say nothing of how dubious and suspicious it is to have changed primary endpoints in the middle of a study, as the AHRP acknowledges. In the simplest terms, imagine you are trying to demonstrate to a friend that your dog has superpowers. To prove this, you set up a trial where your primary endpoint is that your dog can jump 10 feet higher in the air than the average dog, placebo. This is a very specific, extraordinary thing for a dog to do, as not only must he jump 10 feet in the air, he must jump an additional 10 feet over the average dog's jump. So if he can accomplish this, the claim of your dog having superpowers might actually be warranted. The problem is, as you begin logging jump heights, you start to realize, oh, crap. Baxter isn't jumping 10 feet, he's not even close to 10 feet. Determined to prove how great your dog is, you refuse to admit failure toward the primary endpoint. Instead, you simply adjust it mid-study to be that the dog can simply jump higher than the average dog. The results then come in and he is higher by about a half an inch. Do you claim victory still, or do you admit the truth, namely, that you shifted the goalposts and your dog doesn't actually have superpowers? As much as I wish my dog had superpowers, I would admit the truth. Unfortunately for everyone who depends on his judgment though, Anthony Fauci did not do that, and he's also a documented dog murderer, but more on that later. Silly example aside, the following is a quote from Dr. Steve Neeson to the Washington Post, in an article where they cover the scandal, and Dr. Neeson expands on the red flags it presents. 13, I think that they thought they weren't going to win, and they wanted to change it to something they could win on. I prefer the original outcome. It's harder. It's a more meaningful endpoint. Getting out of the hospital early is useful, but it's not a game changer. As Dr. Neeson's questioning makes clear, the primary endpoint change resulted in a conclusion which otherwise would have been negative. This leads to his accurate phrasing of the study's outcome in a win/loss context. Fauci and NIAID's sponsorship of the study for this drug represents a vested interest in its outcome, leading to a win at a time when a win was desperately needed. And this was not only the case for a pandemic response leader in the opening days of a declared pandemic, but also for the relationship of the NIH, the federal government, and Gilead, whose antiviral drug to this point had been an abject failure. You see, the recommendation of remdesivir to treat COVID came from the NIH panel on COVID-19 treatment guidelines. 14 This panel included 7 people with financial ties to Gilead, including Daniel Campbell, who is on Gilead's advisory board, as well as David Glidden and Eric Darr, who are consultants for the company. In addition to these members of the panel, a petition had been filed requesting Fauci himself, the highest paid government employee at over $410,000 annual salary, disclose any financial ties he might have to the company, since he had not yet done so related to any pharmaceutical company financial conflicts. 15,16 But besides their distinct conflicts with the company, the federal government and NIH were also heavily invested in the drug itself. According to a Public Citizen report, public financial support for remdesivir's development, initially for Ebola, totaled at least $70 million, likely higher, through federal grants and clinical trials. 17 Patent rights group Knowledge Ecology International, K., also discovered via Freedom of Information Act requests that the U.S. Army, the CDC, and the NIH/NIAID all either conducted or funded much of the preclinical and clinical development of remdesivir. 18 They were initially blocked in this FOIA pursued by the NIH, but received the disclosure after subsequently suing the organization for failure to respond. And this is relevant especially because remdesivir is a particularly expensive drug. As a result of Fauci's promotion, the Trump administration bought up 500,000 treatment courses at around $3,200 per course. 19 For context, developed countries outside the U.S. still pay around $2,340 per course, with generics manufacturers in India selling a copied design for $320 per course. Trump was not alone in buying up massive stocks of remdesivir, however, as the European Commission also bought up 500,000 treatment courses in 2020.20. Just to summarize this entire deal in the simplest of terms, a taxpayer-funded study was carried out by the organization of the highest paid taxpayer-funded government employee. This poorly conducted study was used to measure the utility of this point-failed drug, which was developed largely using taxpayer dollars. The study results were at odds with those of another study held in higher regard by prominent doctors/scientists, but was recommended and approved anyway by government panels with documented conflicts of interest and a direct development, funding arrangement with the manufacturing organization. The EUA then granted 2 days later gave sole treatment status to an extremely expensive drug with negligible benefits, no history of prior use, and a bad risk profile, bought up in droves with taxpayer money, by the same government that used taxpayer money to fund its development. And all of this occurred without as much as a peer review of the study's results, in an environment where censorship ran rampant and was encouraged by those spending the taxpayer money. To put a few astonishing bows on this trove of corruption, Kay also reported in March of 2020 that the FDA had given Gilead a patent monopoly on remdesivir for 7 years, despite extensive U.S. government funding of the drug. 21 This means the FDA would not be allowed to register a generic version of the drug for use for COVID for 7 years. The FDA informed Kay that the decision about the patent application, including, curiously, the date of submission, was confidential, which Kay blasted. 22, allowing Gilead an incredible monopoly on a potential treatment for a global pandemic, and giving them the power to charge incredibly high, national, budget, breaking prices for remdesivir. It is appalling that the FDA would hand over such a powerful monopoly in such an unprecedented time, and insist that the date of submission is confidential information when a corporation is seemingly manipulating statutes in order to ensure market superiority that was intended to help stimulate innovation in the treatment of truly rare diseases. This is especially troubling because of the timing only 1 month before Fauci's sketchy study pronouncement and the subsequent EUA approval, but also because of how intensely the FDA in particular would act to suppress all other possible treatments, more on that in the next chapter, for the symptoms attributed to COVID. And to be fair, the act of granting EUAs to drugs with some unknowns during a declared emergency is not particularly shocking or unethical on the face of it. but the way in which the FDA in coordination with the NIH and CDC failed to grant this same status to drugs with better demonstrated success and risk profiles, makes no sense whatsoever outside of some other motive. Months after the EUA approval, on October 23, 2020, the FDA would grant full approval to remdesivir. To make matters even more absurd, this approval came 1 week after the WHO reported their own trial on the drug, titled Solidarity. 23. The Solidarity trial found remdesivir had little to no effect on a COVID patient's chance of survival. Reporting on the FDA's full approval despite the negative outcome of this trial, among others, USA Today noted the strange situation, pointing out, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration late Friday allowed the drug remdesivir to be used on all patients hospitalized with COVID-19, although no published research supports such widespread use. 24. They also got the opinion of Dr. Eric Topol on the matter, who said he was appalled by the expanded approval. It seems to be a pattern of approval without science, without data, without evidence. There are no data to support wide use of remdesivir. This is extraordinary. Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren rightly questioned then-President Trump for the unethical deal to buy up remdesivir and the windfall it would provide Gilead. 25. What they and many others seemingly failed to question in their game of politics, however, is who was actually responsible: Fauci, the FDA, etc. And whether or not remdesivir was even worth spending any taxpayer money on at all. In a press conference, U.S. Representative Lloyd Doggett got a little closer to making this point, acknowledging that Gilead is overcharging on a drug that was saved from the scrap heap of failed drugs only because of taxpayer-funded research. 26. And that's exactly what remdesivir was, a scrap heap drug not only for its lack of effectiveness at its stated purpose, but also for its horrendous risk profile, a risk profile Fauci would have known damn well about, thanks to trials conducted only 2 years earlier for the treatment of Ebola. An evident, unacknowledged cause of severe COVID-19 in hospitals, remdesivir side effects. So far we've established the corrupt, anti-scientific actions of Anthony Fauci and the FDA, which led to the unsupported, sole, treatment status of remdesivir for COVID hospitalized patients throughout 2020 and much of 2021. But what's the big deal, right? According to the studies, the drug maybe reduced hospitalization time by a day or two, or if not had no benefit at all, so basically it was at least better than nothing. No. The answer is no. Remdesivir has literally been demonstrated to be worse than nothing, even outside of the people pulled out of the Lancet study due to severe adverse reactions from the drug. And as stated previously, Fauci would have known this perfectly well. In late 2018, NIAID sponsored a study called Investigational Therapeutics for the Treatment of People with Ebola Virus Disease. 27. They also published a review of the study as recently as December 2019, called 2 Drugs Reduce the Risk of Death from Ebola. 28. The review explained the 4 drugs tested in the study were ZMapp, MAB114, Reg, EB3, and remdesivir. All but remdesivir, an antiviral, were monoclonal antibody treatments. Of particularly interesting note, the primary endpoint of this NIAID-sponsored study was the drug's impact on mortality. Also ironically fascinating, was the point the NIH made to point out the importance of early treatment, considering their position not a few months later to refrain from treating COVID patients outside of hospitals. Returning to the study itself, the 2 drugs found to reduce mortality risk were MAB114 and Reg, EB3. The trial's safety monitors recommended that ZMapp, considered the control treatment, and remdesivir be removed from the trial following the results of the first 499 participants involved, due to safety concerns. These drugs were also much less effective in reducing death. 50% of participants died versus 35% with the other two, with remdesivir being the least effective of the four, 53%, even worse than the control treatment. That remdesivir would become the first choice for a NIAID-sponsored study on the treatment of COVID in February of 2020 despite these results, summarized only 2 months prior, is mind-boggling. First of all, why would the first choice not have been a monoclonal antibody treatment, since each of the three in the Ebola trial were demonstrated superior in reducing mortality? Wouldn't the immediacy of the alleged pandemic demand a better use of resources and time? Surely Fauci would have had these trials front of mind too, since he is literally quoted opining on the results in the aforementioned December 2019 NIH summary. If Fauci was at all concerned with finding an effective treatment, why not start with what he would have known from recent experience works better, i.e. monoclonal antibodies? And this brings us to the flip side of that question, why would remdesivir have been considered at all, given both its lack of effectiveness and the findings of the trial's safety monitors? The drug was pulled early, not only because it was worse than the baseline treatment at the primary endpoint of mortality reduction, but also because of serious side effects, one of which is acknowledged as having caused a death by hypotension. The case also cannot be made that the Ebola study's increased deaths and side effects would somehow be different than they would when used for COVID. Those side effects were actually confirmed not just in the Lancet study in the spring of 2020 but also by the WHO in late August of 2020.29 specifically. The WHO noted a disproportionately high number of reports of liver and kidney problems in patients receiving remdesivir, compared with those receiving other drugs for the treatment of COVID. From their report, regarding remdesivir, a major increase in reports was seen in this review. The new reports for remdesivir in a suspect or interacting role in this review comprise 76% of the cumulative total of reports. Adding the updated reports since the last review, this number increases to 91%. A vast majority of reports which included hepatic liver-related terms mentioned above were coded as serious. Except for reports on cases reported with a fatal outcome, most of these hepatic terms were fatal only in a minority, 10%, of reported cases. Notable exceptions are hepatic failure and acute hepatic failure where 37% and 67% of cases respectively were fatal. The majority of the reports of the renal terms were coded as serious and a smaller proportion of the reports were coded as having a fatal outcome. It doesn't even stop with the WHO/Ebola trials, either. The following are additional support for the findings of severe toxicity in remdesivir. A 2015 review in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics found a link between remdesivir and acute renal, kidney, failure. A late 2020 safety review was launched by the European Medicines Agency after patients report acute kidney injury after taking the drug. 31 A 2021 review by Twafkia et al. In Clinical Microbiology and Infection connected remdesivir to cardiac events, finding the following. 32. In recent clinical trials some cardiac arrhythmias were reported with use of remdesivir for COVID-19. We found 302 cardiac effects including 94 bradycardia, 31%, among the 2,603 reports with remdesivir prescribed in COVID-19 patients. Most of the 94 reports were serious, 75, 80%, and in 16 reports, 17%, evolution was fatal. The use of remdesivir was associated with an increased risk of reporting bradycardia. The previously mentioned review also identified similar outcomes. In the aforementioned Lancet study, cardiac arrest following remdesivir use, and even in Fauci's own NIAID-sponsored study, in which more cardiac arrhythmias occurred with the use of remdesivir than with placebo, 8% versus 2%, September 2021 Phase 3 clinical trial by Ader et al. Published in The Lancet concluded. 33. No clinical benefit was observed from the use of remdesivir in patients who were admitted to hospital for COVID-19, were symptomatic for more than 7 days, and required oxygen support. 3 deaths, acute respiratory distress syndrome, bacterial infection, and hepatorenal syndrome, were considered related to remdesivir by the investigators. My emphasis. It bears repeating at this point, the FDA gave full approval to remdesivir only a month or two after it was demonstrated by the WHO to have the worst risk profile of any of the drugs used over the past year and a half, as well as only 5 months after the NIH summarized that it was worse than baseline for treating Ebola and had been pulled early from that trial. The WHO would even go on to reaffirm its opposition to remdesivir in November of 2020, citing, no important effect on mortality, need for mechanical ventilation, time to clinical improvement, and other patient, important outcomes. 34 severe adverse reactions from the drug in the various trials mentioned include hypotension, acute respiratory distress syndrome, bacterial infection, a variety of kidney issues including kidney failure, a variety of liver issues including liver failure, and even cardiac events such as bradycardia. Despite all of this, according to News Medical Life Sciences, remdesivir is used in as much as 50% of hospitalized COVID patients in the U.S., at least. 35 It was used from the very beginning too, as the first confirmed patient, 35 years old, determined to have COVID in the U.S. was for some inexplicable reason treated using it, a drug never before approved for any use. 36 So now we can clearly see how significant Fossey's standard of care declaration proved to be and the implications it would have, given the drug's risk profile, as we move on to reviewing the societal outcomes of these calamitous actions. We begin at the epicenters of the alleged COVID outbreaks, China, Italy, and New York. In the first days of the alleged pandemic, Johns Hopkins captured the shock of doctors the world over as they stewed over how a respiratory disease like COVID could be causing patients to experience heart and kidney problems. 37 In fact, according to Johns Hopkins, up to 30% of hospitalized patients in China and New York developed moderate or severe kidney injury. While various theories were floated for why COVID was causing this, they admitted the answer was not yet clear. I would contend they were most likely asking the wrong question by assuming the cause without evidence. And while we have made the case for this by citing trial outcomes and use of the drug in the US so far, we can also see China had experience of its own with remdesivir in the opening days of the COVID era. 38, Case 1, a 31-year-old man from Wuhan, China, started on the drug on illness day 11. It was stopped 4 days later because of liver alterations and a maculopapular rash. The liver abnormalities improved after discontinuing the treatment. Case 2, an 80-year-old man from China was given remdesivir for 2 days. It was discontinued when his kidneys failed. The gentleman received the drug again as the disease severity persisted and progressed. He died 9 days later. Case 3, a 39-year-old man with obesity and obstructive sleep apnea received 8 doses of remdesivir, which was stopped because of liver enzyme alterations and the same kind of rash as was seen in Case 1. This resolved after the drug was discontinued. The gentleman was discharged on day 20. Case 4, a 76-year-old man from France with a history of chronic kidney injury received remdesivir for 9 days without side effects. He was discharged on illness day 23. Case 5, a 70-year-old man with a history of chronic obstructive bronchopneumonopathy was admitted with acute respiratory distress syndrome. Remdesivir was given for 2 days and discontinued because he suffered acute kidney injury, requiring a kidney transplant. His disease progressed and he died. The connection of the side effects of the primary treatment for COVID with the alleged complications of it cannot be ignored. This is especially true considering the ambiguity of COVID case, identification, and the seemingly endless list of COVID's symptoms and complications. The following are among those complications, and they will look eerily familiar: acute kidney injury 39, multiple organ failure 40, hypotension 41, septic shock 42, bradycardia 43, cardiac arrhythmia 44. To wrap this section up, we recall the complete lack of support for the claim that there exists any evidence of a novel, virus-caused pandemic. From erroneous death attribution methodology, to extraordinarily high false positive PCR tests which don't even test for the alleged novel virus itself, to all other statistical/epidemiological sleights of hand mentioned, we have made the case that there must be some better explanation with real evidence for abnormal hospital morbidity/mortality in specific areas. The observed severe side effects of remdesivir having been the same as the severe, unexplainable, complications of COVID, is a better explanation with real, documented evidence. This is especially the case when considering experimental remdesivir was the only authorized and most widely used treatment for the aforementioned, novel respiratory disease. And from our reviews of how easy it would be to mistake, and/or intentionally mischaracterize, ordinary flu/pneumonia hospitalizations as something new, it is a logical conclusion to determine this mischaracterization and resulting dangerous treatment recommendation was one of the true causes of the most severe symptoms called COVID-19 in 2020 and beyond. When this many cases of illness are being mischaracterized using nonsensical methodology, misdiagnoses will lead to mistreatment. In the COVID era, with the exceptional amount of misdiagnosis under one scary umbrella disease title, that mistreatment was remdesivir. At the same time though, it wasn't the only one. The finisher of lungs, the abuse of ventilators in April of 2020, the height of the COVID panic, New York City physician Cameron Kyle, Seidel posted 2 videos on YouTube. 45 as New York was the U.S. epicenter for the disaster taking place in hospitals, Dr. Kyle, Seidel was in a desperate situation and felt, based on what he'd personally seen to that point, that the entire approach to treating COVID by hospitals was incorrect. In fact, he too didn't believe the disease he was seeing made sense in the context of a viral pneumonia at all. In treating these patients, I have witnessed medical phenomena that just don't make sense in the context of treating a disease that is supposed to be a viral pneumonia. The patients I'm seeing in front of me, the lungs I'm trying to improve, have led me to believe that COVID-19 is not this disease, and that we are operating under a medical paradigm that is untrue. In short, I believe we are treating the wrong disease, and I fear that this misguided treatment will lead to a tremendous amount of harm to a great number of people in a very short time. I feel compelled to give this information out. COVID-19 lung disease, as far as I can see, is not a pneumonia and should not be treated as one. These patients are slowly being starved of oxygen. Since the propagandists of this entire situation saw it fit to use wartime language, let's consider a similar scenario. Let's say instead of being a doctor, Cameron Kyle, Seidel was a soldier in a war. And let's say while he's out on the front line executing the strategy of his superior officers, he notices something is off. The enemy is not following their expected attack patterns on which his army's plans were based, and his fellow soldiers are heading into a massacre. As things are looking dire, Seidel finds a radio and blasts out his message on all frequencies in the hopes enough people will listen so the plan can be changed and potentially countless lives saved. Unfortunately, however, what starts as a shocking message to many is ultimately turned to static, as his radio has been jammed by his own army's technicians. The outcome of this scenario is a massacre and, if justice were to be done, a punishment of treason for any involved in jamming the radio. This is exactly what Dr. Seidel described happening in real life, short of justice being done, so far. You see, like many doctors who were directly involved in caring for patients, the very last people you'd want censored during a pandemic, Dr. Seidel's video pleas were taken down from YouTube and their sharing prevented on social media. 46. And while this common COVID-era practice remains just as vile now as it was when we covered it at length previously, the biggest problem as it related to this particular message was in the doctor's determination that ventilators were being overused and were themselves causing the very lung damage which was ravaging the hospital systems at the height of the phenomenon. When we treat people with ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, we typically use ventilators to treat respiratory failure. But these patients' muscles work fine, my emphasis. I fear that if we are using a false paradigm to treat a new disease, then the method that we program into the ventilator, one based on respiratory failure as opposed to oxygen failure, that this method being widely adopted, aims to increase pressure on the lungs in order to open them up, is actually doing more harm than good. And that the pressure we are providing to lungs, we may be providing to lungs that cannot take it. And that the ARDS that we are seeing may be nothing more than lung injury caused by the ventilator, my emphasis. And again in his second video, we are putting breathing tubes in people and putting them on ventilators and dialing up the pressure to open their lungs. I've talked to doctors all around the country and it is becoming increasingly clear that the pressure we are providing may be hurting their lungs. Plenty of other doctors would come to agree with Dr. Kyle Seidel, as pointed out by Reuters in April of 2020.47. However, in the same special report, the authors also mentioned that ventilators had become a major weapon for medics fighting COVID-19, and that when the alleged pandemic began, governments around the world raced to build or buy ventilators. At the time, the US had spent $2.9 billion for nearly 190,000 ventilators, according to the authors. President Trump would even declare the US was the king of ventilators. The outcome of this would have been predictable and avoidable if the approach was the free back and forth spread of information during a time when it was most needed. As Business Insider reported, however, at least 80% of NYC's COVID patients who were put on ventilators ultimately died. 48. This is yet another case of the horrific failure of the very authoritative voices people like Bill Gates and Jen Psaki openly claim should be the sole sources of information. And when combined with the policy of remdesivir as the only treatment in the very hospitals people eventually ended up on these ventilators in, the outcomes become even more troubling. For one example, consider the aforementioned remdesivir-tied kidney failures. Per doctors on Health Tap, kidney failure leads to toxic fluid buildup, which backs up into the lungs. 49. During the alleged pandemic, medical professionals puzzled over and theorized about how COVID was causing fluid buildup in the lungs. 51. Wonders what the additional impact on these fluid-filled lungs would be of excessive ventilation. For another example, recall the findings of the aforementioned clinical microbiology and infection study that the use of remdesivir was associated with an increased risk of reporting bradycardia. Per Mayo Clinic, bradycardia is a slower than normal heart rate, which can prevent the brain and other organs from getting enough oxygen. 51. Taking the two things together, along with the fact that remdesivir was being used since literally the first U.S. patient, as we found, Dr. Kyle Seidel's findings of patients being starved of oxygen, can be explained without having to resort to complex theories of animal, human transmissions or lab leaks, both of which we will expand upon in future chapters. And whether one agrees with my assessment on there being no evidence of a novel coronavirus or not, it cannot be disputed that this overall hospital strategy to combat illness in the spring of 2020 was an absolute disaster of pandemic proportions. As Dr. Kyle Seidel and the others who have been cited clearly demonstrate, this is not even a controversial opinion amongst the very people doing the combating in those hospitals. If they were right, as history and science seem to have validated they were, it would be downright false to fail to attribute much of the death during this time to medical malpractice and or the mistakes they admitted to making. This is not to say they can't be forgiven for these mistakes. But it is without question that those who gave the orders, mischaracterized the damages the orders caused, and then deemed their own authority significant enough to censor, or encourage censoring, the mere questioning of their actions, should not go unpunished. The New York nursing home scandal of 2020, that didn't just occur in New York. Of all the points made in this chapter, the nursing home scandal of 2020 is probably the most well known. At this point it is well documented that various politicians and public health officials around the world, perhaps most notably, Andrew Cuomo of New York, redirected overflow COVID patients from hospitals to nursing homes in the spring of 2020.52. It is pointless to beat this obviously catastrophic mistake into the ground, so I won't linger here long. However, it is part of the history of this entire disaster, and my purpose with this book is to account for each of the criminal/negligent actions taken. This is certainly one of those actions. And it is so whether you are of the mind there is a novel coronavirus or that there is no evidence of one, because, if you think there is a novel coronavirus, these people locked down the young and violated basic human rights in the name of protecting the old and vulnerable, while at the same time sending people known to be sick people straight to the old and vulnerable. If you see no evidence of a novel coronavirus, these actions still overextend nursing homes, thus reducing the standard of care for people who are already old and vulnerable, which obviously increases their risk of getting sick and going without care. In general, it goes without saying that these hospital overflow patients were also largely not going to receive the type of care they'd need from a nursing home. This combination of factors would make worsened mortality a certainty for all involved. And again, given the fraud of the tests and the absurd case methodologies, these deaths cannot accurately be attributed to anything but the negligence of those who pulled these strings. The final thing that makes the scandal so necessary to call out is the disgusting efforts by its perpetrators to bury it. The American Spectator article cited above provides one example of this. Author Paul Kengor points out how the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health had the nerve to play victim when being misgendered during a hard question by a radio host on this very topic. This type of feigned emotional wounding turned out to be so convenient for Secretary Levine, that causing the deaths of thousands apparently paled in comparison. Levine's actions were, in fact, so repugnant that during a press conference it was admitted Levine's own 95-year-old mother was removed from her nursing home, just as the secretary was condemning others to them. And Levine, who, unsurprisingly at this point, has previously endorsed puberty blockers for minors, not only got away with this, but was actually promoted in short order to the federal government twice, most recently to a 4-star admiral position without any military experience. 53. While that whole paragraph may or may not sound shocking and dystopian to future generations, such absurdities by America's major/mainstream institutions are now expected by the average, common American. For many, like myself, it's become as humorous as it is just downright pathetic. But not much straddled the line between hilarity and vulgarity during the COVID era as effectively as the actions of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Having been the most public of the nursing home offenders from the beginning, Cuomo would do everything he could to cover his deadly scandal up. He'd have a lot of help from the downright creepy corporate propaganda machine as well, more on that later. But Cuomo's book, American Crisis, Leadership Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic, truly must have been one of the most ironic written since O.J. Simpson's If I Did It. 54. This appalling attempt to rewrite history by one of the lead criminals in the COVID crimes against humanity is so on the nose that again, it cannot be permitted without pushback. Today Cuomo has resigned from office, having been charged with a sex crime, and is under investigation for covering up the death toll his nursing home directive created. 55,56 Unfortunately, COVID, is still wrongly considered the cause of these deaths by his accusers, so he will likely escape without the full extent of blame that justice demands. However, the lack of recognition of the underlying crime by broken institutions doesn't negate it. These deaths are attributable directly to Cuomo, as they are to Levine and any other official who gave similar directives. A good death, death penalty drugs and the English midazolam euthanasia scandal. Luke Evans, a good death, my emphasis, needs three things: it needs equipment, it needs medication, and it needs the staff to administer it. So in terms of equipment, a few quick questions. Do you have enough syringe drivers in the NHS to deliver medications to keep people comfortable when they're passing away? Matt Hancock, yes, we do. There was a challenge raised about this about 8 days ago and we resolved, actually it was as big a challenge as was made public, and we resolved that, so yes, right now we do. Evans, and the second one is, with that the syringe drivers deliver medication, particularly things like midazolam, my emphasis, and morphine. Do you have any precautions put in place to make sure we have enough of those medications to be delivered? Hancock, yes, and we've got a big project to make sure that those medications, as well as the ITU medications I spoke about earlier, that the supply chains, local supply chains that support those medicines, are clear. They are, in fact, those medicines are made in a relatively small number of factories around the world. So it is a delicate supply chain and we are in contact with the whole supply chain. Evans, in line with that, morphine is currently prescribed per patient. The reason for that is to stop it being abused, my emphasis. I would have to prescribe it for Mr. Hancock, for example. In this situation, however, if you are going into a healthcare home, you may not want to waste precious things such as morphine. Have you considered relaxing the laws on doctors and healthcare professionals prescribing morphine, so that there is no waste, my emphasis? Hancock, this is something we keep under review. I have looked at that particular point, to reduce wastage of key medicines. It is something that the supply and clinical teams in the department talk about all the time. Video conference discussion between UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock and MPDR. Luke Evans, early 200 and 2057 euthanasia, from Greek, epsilon theta alpha nu alpha sigma alpha, good death, my emphasis, epsilon, EU well, good plus theta nu alpha tau omicron, then atos death, is the practice of intentionally ending life, my emphasis, to relieve pain and suffering. Euthanasia, Greek origin as identified in definition 58 in UK MPDR. Luke Evans' own words, the UK government adopted a policy of euthanizing COVID patients in 2020 using midazolam. That's not a provocative statement or a theory or anything other than their publicly stated plan of action. And if I was less thorough, I could end this section right here and let you stew on the moral implications of that without any more elaboration. The concept of euthanasia in general is one which is part of an extremely difficult, intense moral debate, specifically when considering whether or not a person being euthanized has given or has the capacity to give informed consent. As a side note, the most interesting, nuanced course I took in college included this very topic, among other difficult life and death decisions. For more on that, I would highly recommend the book Life and Death Decisions by my professor in that class, Sheldon Eckland, Olson. 59. However, the practice of euthanizing patients during an alleged respiratory pandemic, and the manner in which the UK government, among others, did so, raises extremely troubling questions to which attention must be drawn. So we will start by reviewing the drug used to this end itself, midazolam. As covered by NPR in their September 2020, of all times, article, Gasping for Air, Autopsies Reveal Troubling Effects of Lethal Injection, midazolam is a sedative used in executions and a controversial one even for that purpose. 60 in death penalty autopsies reviewed by NPR, they found that of 32 inmates executed using midazolam, 87% had developed pulmonary edema, a condition when the lungs fill with fluids such as blood and plasma. One inmate on death row is described as having wheezed and gasped for air, as he was executed with the drug. Anatomical pathologist Mark Edgar presented these types of findings on the drug during a federal court hearing in the Southern District of Ohio in December 2018.61. He informed the court that inmates executed using midazolam specifically would experience severe respiratory distress, my emphasis, with associated sensations of drowning, asphyxiation, panic, and terror. And the magistrate judge acknowledged his findings, writing in his decision, all medical witnesses to describe pulmonary edema agreed it was painful, both physically and emotionally, inducing a sense of drowning and the attendant panic and terror, much as would occur with the torture tactic known as waterboarding. Doctors who spoke to NPR informed them that extremely high doses of drugs, given quickly, directly damage the delicate architecture of the lungs. They describe these high doses as the 500 milligrams given to an inmate, versus the 1 to 2 milligrams given to sedated hospital patients. This is a key place to take a step back and break our analysis into two parts: midazolam for the purposes of administering a good death, as MPDR. Evans describes it, and midazolam in low doses, 1 to 2 milligrams, as a hospital sedative. The reason this needs to be broken out is first because it cannot be assumed that the prescription amount is the same in both instances, especially with DR. Evans openly requesting, without pushback, that Health Secretary Matt Hancock relax the laws on prescribing amounts. If one were to want to give someone a good death, using midazolam, as DR. Evans claims to, along with wanting to reduce waste, then a higher dose would surely be required, the same way it is in an attempt to give a death penalty inmate a good death. Only, as we saw with the NPR article, midazolam not only doesn't provide a good death, it actually contributes to a drowning, like suffering from the lungs filling with fluid. Perhaps ironically or perhaps intentionally, I will make no claims about intent. The lungs filling with fluid also happens to be a complication of COVID, as we've covered previously. Subsequent whistleblower allegations of misuse of the drug in the UK came from a variety of sources. 62,63 and support for these claims is readily available, as in an official guidance document titled, COVID-19 and Palliative and End of Life in Secondary Care, the Association for Palliative Medicine of Great Britain and Ireland, APM, confirms our aforementioned suspicions on how the drug was used for end-of-life care. 64 in a section titled, Management of Agitation at the End of Life in COVID-19, the APM recommends as much as 60 milligrams of midazolam, a far cry from the 1 to 2 milligrams used in normal hospital circumstances. And use of midazolam was no less abusive for patients who weren't at the end of their life either, as we mentioned in the second point. In a section titled, Management of Breathlessness and Anxiety in COVID-19, the APM still recommends as much as 20 milligrams of midazolam for severe cases, more than 10 times the average hospital use amount. For the purposes of respiratory illness, sedatives such as midazolam are meant to reduce stress caused by struggling lungs. And this is fine at a normal dosage, but these were clearly not normal dosages. In fact, the media even publicly acknowledged that nurses were sedating patients more to manage workload, in response to hospital ICU strain during this time, apparently as opposed to limited sedation as a means of meaningful treatment. 65 The picture becomes even darker when considering the side effects, which drugs.com reports as respiratory depression and respiratory arrest. 66 Again, both of these also happen to be considered symptoms of COVID. Whether or not we're talking about end-of-life use or in-hospital care use too, the sheer emphasis placed on a sedative at this time is very strange on its face, even ignoring the side effect profile. First of all, the pharmaceutical journal, PJ, reported in May 2020 that the NHS had been buying up extraordinary amounts of the drug from French distributors, and was doing so at 4 different strengths. 67 Now, I'm all for stress reduction as a means of care since stress is tied to basically all disease. However, there doesn't seem to be any good reason why it would be necessary to purchase abnormal volumes of such sedatives at abnormal strength levels, and then to also make recommendations to use them at up to 10 times the dosage of average hospital use, in order to treat a respiratory illness. Adding midazolam's side effect profile of respiratory depression to the equation, it again becomes easier to explain previously mentioned ventilator, questioning New York Dr. Cameron Kyle, Seidel's concern that many COVID patients suffered from reduced oxygen. And we can corroborate this was the case in the US, where Dr. Kyle, Seidel obviously operated, too. Bill Galluccio, for example, reported in April 2020 a 73% increased demand in death penalty drugs for COVID use, including midazolam and fentanyl. 68 According to the doctors Galluccio cited, these drugs were used on ventilator patients. Patients we've already discussed were subsequently dying at a rate greater than 80%. The midazolam scandal is a recognized one in the UK, as reported on by The Sun. 69 One reason why this might be the case there and not in the US is because the UK has public experience with the problem of institutionalized euthanasia. As documented by the Discovery Institute in 2013, the UK's NHS created a protocol called Liverpool Care Pathway, LCP, in order to respond to family member complaints of patients dying in agony in NHS hospitals. 70 While intentions might have started good, the protocol soon shifted from one of palliative care, pain, controlling treatment, to one of terminal sedation, slow motion euthanasia/killing. This problem got so bad that an alarming 16.5% of patients who died in 2007, 2008, died while under continuous deep sedation. An open letter signed by palliative physicians and other pain control experts blowing the whistle on this scandal tied it in a scary way to the COVID era, just as, in the financial world, so-called algorithmic banking has caused problems by blindly following a computer model, so a similar tick-box approach to the management of death is causing a national crisis in care. The government is rolling out a new treatment pattern of palliative care into hospitals, nursing homes, and residential homes. It is based on experience in a Liverpool hospice. If you tick all the right boxes in the Liverpool Care Pathway, the inevitable outcome of the consequent treatment is death. As a result, a nationwide wave of discontent is building up, as family and friends witness the denial of fluids and food to patients. Syringe drivers are being used to give continuous terminal sedation, without regard to the fact that the diagnosis could be wrong. Experienced doctors know that sometimes, when all but essential drugs are stopped, dying patients get better. This proved to be an incredibly prophetic statement for a variety of reasons. The first is that the public health, centralized, tick-box approach to healthcare has largely become the only permitted approach. We've seen the damage of this throughout this book. Another interesting note by these physicians is how family and friends were at least able to speak up for their loved ones after witnessing the LCP in action. Imagine what the consequences could be if hospital patients' family and friends were routinely denied the visiting rights necessary to identify this malpractice. Unfortunately, anyone who lived through the COVID era knows this to have been a common policy of far too many hospitals. And finally, we've already gone into great length about all the non-essential, downright dangerous drugs used during the alleged pandemic, and the physicians make a good point in the final sentence above about the cost of this deadly policy. What makes euthanasia such a difficult question morally is that a person can't be truly informed on the consequences of death. This presents a blurry line for a doctor to have to cross once consent is given. However, Looking past this, it seems many people would be willing to grant a person in excruciating pain a merciful death. And this is not necessarily a repugnant stance to take, so long as the person doing the dying does consent. The problem is that such a scenario is not what Matt Hancock and Dr. Luke Evans discussed. A respiratory illness is not the same as having a mortal wound or terminal cancer. One not only cannot predict with certainty that a respiratory death is both imminent and unpreventable, but a respiratory illness is also one the average person faces with the expectation they will survive it. As such, it is impossible to imagine a scenario where it is not worth it to continue attempting to treat the patient, certain the patient will die, and possible to get the patient's consent. Perhaps no example illustrates this better than the account of comedian Jim Breuer during an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. 71 Breuer recounted a story about his obese friend, who ultimately went to the hospital with COVID. The friend was soon on a ventilator and got stroke-induced brain damage. Originally he was told this stroke was a COVID complication, but it soon became clear it was actually due to a lack of his regular blood pressure and similar maintenance medications while in the hospital. As the series of unfortunate events at the hospital continued, fun fact, he was denied access to hydroxychloroquine. The friend soon became brain dead. Due to insane, evil hospital protocols, his wife and child were told he was going to die and they wouldn't be able to say their goodbyes in person. Fortunately for this man, one last desperate effort by friends secured a visit by an outside specialist, who found that the man wasn't brain dead, he was dehydrated. Within months of being treated for dehydration, he was fully recovered. So my question is this: how many people didn't have the luxury of such passionate friends and an honest outside specialist in 2020, 2021? How many families were too scared, compliant, or trusting to push back against hospitals following the orders of those like Matt Hancock and Dr. Luke Evans? Without the resistance of his friends/family, this man would have been dead, and he'd have been so without any informed consent. And I wonder, what drugs was he given when he was senselessly brought to the point of a coma? At this point I know where I'd put my money, and it'd be as safe a bet as any. An additional dimension to this scandal was also predominantly called out in the UK, where reports came of blanket do not attempt resuscitation orders coerced upon patients without proper consent, like Brewer's friend. 72 such orders reframe the midazolam scandal as a midazolam cover-up. Lastly, is it still difficult to see why I use quotes when referring to COVID patients? To think this man's story was an isolated incident when we know what we do about the testing/methodology is not only not likely, it's absurd. What really sets the midazolam scandal apart from the rest of the crime/misdoings identified in this book is how unmistakably cold-blooded it is. Death penalty drugs were used as alleged treatments. They were so with extraordinary frequency and in abnormally high dosages, and the horrendous death rates which occurred during their usage wasn't even hidden. In fact, these deaths and the side effects of these drugs were verifiably used to establish the pandemic itself, most predominantly through the destructive first wave. More empty profit in the pipeline as 2022 rolled around and the Ukraine story replaced the COVID story for what the mainstream media wanted the world talking about 24/7, the official public health recommendations for COVID treatment remained insane. Hospital patients continued to receive remdesivir while the NIH and CDC for the first time in 2 years decided the suppressed benefits of early treatment were not misinformation, as they'd previously claimed. If you test positive for COVID-19 and have one or more health conditions that increase your risk of becoming very sick, treatment may be available. Contact a health professional right away after a positive test to determine if you may be eligible, even if your symptoms are mild right now. Don't delay, treatment must be started within the first few days to be effective. CDC February 2022 Updated Guidance 73 in order of preference, clinicians should use the oral antiviral nirmatrelvir, ritonavir, Paxlovid, the monoclonal antibody sotrovimab, the 4 antiviral remdesivir, Veklury, and finally, the oral antiviral molnupiravir, said Alice Pal, PharmD, of the NIH COVID-19 Treatment Guidelines Panel. NIH January 2022 Recommendation for Outpatient, Out-of-Hospital, Care 74. We've already covered the horrendous safety profile and real-world outcomes of remdesivir. As for the other 3 mentioned by the NIH, we can start with Paxlovid, Pfizer's COVID drug, which apparently needs to exist despite the company also producing an inoculation meant to provide immunity. In the FDA fact sheet on the drug, the listed adverse effects are allergic reactions, liver problems, resistance to HIV medicines, altered sense of taste. Apparently drugs cause this too: diarrhea, high blood pressure, and muscle aches. 75. Now I don't mention these things to disqualify the drug. Though they might be enough for me not to take it, drug fact sheets surely all include lists of potential side effects. However, consider the following caveat the FDA makes right after listing these side effects: these are not all the possible side effects of Paxlovid. Not many people have taken Paxlovid. Serious and unexpected side effects may happen. Paxlovid is still being studied, so it is possible that all of the risks are not known at this time. You will recall, this is somehow the first recommended treatment the NIH says people should take in the outpatient setting if they test positive. And the reason why they would recommend a brand new drug shouldn't be surprising at this point. If you didn't already guess, the US government inexplicably, other than the explanation of corruption, bought up $5.3 billion worth of Paxlovid in November 2021, a month before the FDA authorized it for emergency use. 76,77 Another interesting note comes from the FDA's December 2021 post-authorization press release, in which they claim, Paxlovid is not a substitute for vaccination in individuals for whom COVID-19 vaccination and a booster dose are recommended. 78 The first thing to note here is there is a very specific reason this, not a substitute, language is used, which we will get to in our chapters on inoculations. Beyond that though, this statement seems to imply Paxlovid is not specifically intended for those who did not receive the inoculation, in which case it would seem Pfizer both didn't protect the inoculated from the disease in question and is also now set to profit again off that fact. However, Paxlovid, 2 inoculation doses, and a booster are not all you need to subject your body to in less than a year to be protected. According to the NIH, Paxlovid should also be boosted with the HIV drug ritonavir. 79 To any who opt into all of the above experimentation, I would say, please, on behalf of your body, at least ask for sponsorship money from Pfizer. You've earned at least that. Moving on, monoclonal antibodies seem to have worked for people and improved mortality outcomes in the aforementioned Ebola study, but supply has been increasingly short at a time of increased demand. 80 Since the federal government controls the supply and was all in on an obsessive inoculation only campaign, many questions were raised about this by both states such as Texas and observers alike. 81,82 As for Merck's molnupiravir, doctors such as Rajesh Gandhi of Boston's Mass General Hospital have been reluctant to prescribe it for its ineffectiveness. 83 Still, as covered by TrialSite News, the U.S. government has also bought up $2.2 billion of it after providing Merck $365 million in taxpayer funding for its development, so the conflict of interest to encourage its use remains. 84 But the safety profile remains in question for this drug as well, as documented by the FDA in its fact sheet. 85 One extremely troubling warning, of the several included, reads as follows: advise individuals of childbearing potential to use effective contraception correctly and consistently while taking molnupiravir and for 4 days after the last dose. While the risk is regarded as low, non-clinical studies to fully assess the potential for molnupiravir to affect offspring of treated males have not been completed. Advise sexually active individuals with partners of childbearing potential to use a reliable method of contraception consistently and correctly while taking molnupiravir and for at least 3 months after the last dose of molnupiravir. The risk beyond 3 months after the last dose of molnupiravir is unknown. The FDA, NIH, WHO, and CDC have taken an experimental, drug-only approach to the COVID era. This strategy has come with glaring conflicts of interest and without the least bit of success. In fact, the outcomes point to a resoundingly negative impact overall, in many cases causing the very problems which were attributed to a viral pandemic. At the same time, it was not the case that there were not better, cheaper, more available alternatives. There absolutely were in spades, and those alternatives were actively suppressed despite observably positive results. We will cover them in detail in the next chapter.